The Colbert Show that he graduated to rock star status in our house that night. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bart Ehrman.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming out. It's a pleasure to be with you. Does this sound all right? Sound okay? It's echoey here, but that's how it happens sometimes. So, I'm glad to be with you. I've been spending my time teaching 19-year-olds at Chapel Hill, and this is a different kind of environment, and so I very much appreciate your presence here. So I'm teaching my class this semester on the New Testament. This is an introduction to the New Testament for undergraduates, and most of my students are from North Carolina, and most of them have been raised in the church, and most of them are taking a class on the New Testament because they're thinking, how hard can it be? It's the New Testament. We're not talking quantum physics here. I mean, this is like how hard it can be. And they figure, well, I grew up in church, and so I know about the New Testament. So the first day of class, I handed out my syllabus. This was 2 weeks ago. I handed out my syllabus, and I explained what we're going to do, and I explained this isn't this isn't a church, this isn't a Sunday school class. We're going to be approaching the New Testament from a very different kind of perspective from the one that you have probably been accustomed to. We're not going to approach it from a theological or a believing point of view. We're not going to approach it from a non-believing point of view. The belief is irrelevant for this class. It doesn't matter what you believe. You can be a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim or Hindu, anything else. It doesn't really matter. You can be an atheist, agnostic, pagan. It doesn't matter because we're approaching the New Testament from a historical perspective. We're going to look at it the way a historian would look at the New Testament and the history of early Christianity, historical Jesus. I'm not saying this is the best way to do it. I'm not saying it's the only way to do it. I'm just saying it's the way we're going to do it. And so that's how we're going to do it in here. And so I hand out the syllabus, I explain all that, and then I give them a pop quiz. Now, they think it's very strange for me to be giving them a pop quiz before I've taught them anything. But I give them this quiz because I want to know how much they know about the New Testament before I start the class. I also want them to know how much they know about the New Testament before they start the class. And so I give them this quiz. So I do this every year, and I have 11 questions on this quiz. I told the class that if anyone in here gets 8 of these 11 right, I'll buy you dinner at the Armadillo Grill. I owe 1 dinner out of 150 students. And they're not hard questions. They're questions that have nothing to do with biblical scholarship. There's nothing scholarly about this exam, so I'm not asking complicated things that require a lot of jargon and back. It's basic information about the New Testament, just to see, what do they know? And so just to give you an example, I start off by asking them, how many books are in the New Testament? Well, basic, wrong, but thank you for playing. So the answer is actually 27. This is an easy answer. And the reason it's easy, I explained to them, the reason it's easy is this. When you think about the Bible, you think about God. When you think about God in the New Testament, you think about the Christian God. And when you think about the Christian God, you think about the Trinity. And what is 27? It's 3 to the 3rd power. 3 times 3 times 3, 27. It's a miracle. And so we go from there. So my next question to them is, in what language were these books written? Now, this is very interesting. About, a third to a half of the students think that the answer is Hebrew. And I'm never quite sure why they think Hebrew. I suppose it's because when you watch all these shows on Discovery Channel or History Channel, and it's anything having to do with the Bible, even if it's about the New Testament, they're always flashing up these Hebrew things in the background. And so I guess you think Hebrew, Jesus is a Jew, Hebrew, Jewish language, must be Hebrew, right? Wrong. It's not Hebrew. This year, maybe only 4 or 5 thought that the answer was English. Right. So the answer to that one is Greek. The New Testament was originally written in Greek. And so I explained to them that in the Roman Empire, Greek was the lingua franca. It was the language people spoke, so that educated people in the Roman world learned Greek. Just as today, if you go to Europe, it doesn't matter whether you're in France or in Italy or in Germany, you can get by on English. Well, back in the Roman Empire, you could get by on Greek. And so that gives me a chance to talk to them about Alexander the Great and how the Roman world became influenced by Greek culture. So I'm using this quiz in order to teach them a few things that are kind of basics about the New Testament. Now, I do throw in a few curveballs on this exam because I don't want to buy any dinners. So one of the questions I ask is, what was the Apostle Paul's last name? And invariably somebody will say, of Tarsus. Right, okay, Paul of Tarsus. Yeah, okay, good enough. That works. But the point of that question is that I want them to know that most people in the ancient world didn't have last names. People had only a first name. That's why in the New Testament, you have all these people with the same name, and you have to identify them in some way. So you have all these Marys in the New Testament. And whenever there's a Mary, they'll tell you which Mary it is. It's Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and they're all these Marys. And so you have to know which one it is because they didn't have last names. The reason I need to teach this to my students is because they think that with Jesus Christ, and so I have to tell them, it's not Jesus Christ born to Joseph and Mary Christ. It's not his last name. The word Christ means Messiah. So if you're saying Jesus Christ, you're saying Jesus is the Messiah. So I give them this quiz, and we go from there into the semester. So you'll be happy to know I'm not giving you a quiz, and there will be no final exam at the end of this. I'm talking about an issue that I think is one of the fundamental issues for the New Testament and also for the history of Christianity, and I would argue for the history of Western civilization, what I'm talking about are the next 3 periods. The 3 lectures are focused on the question of how Jesus became God. Now, I'm not asking that in a theological sense. I'm not saying like how did the man Jesus really become God. I'm asking how is it that people came to think of Jesus as God? How in people's understanding did the man Jesus come to be understood to be a divine being? And in this lecture, I'm not saying that he wasn't a divine being. I'm not saying that he was a divine being. I'm approaching this just from the historical point of view. When did people start saying he was God, and why did they say that? And what did they mean by it? As it turns out, different people meant different things by it. So you might think that if you say Jesus is God, there's only like one option for what that means. Wrong. As you're going to see, there are lots of options. So what I want to do in this lecture is start at the very beginning with Jesus himself. And my question is, did Jesus call himself God? And even more than that, did Jesus think he was God? My answer is going to be no. I think the answer is no. Now, that has no bearing on the question of whether Jesus was God. If you think that Jesus was God who became a human being, then you have to think that he limited himself in some ways to become a human being if he's really a human being. And one of the ways he could limit himself is in his knowledge. Of course, my students at Chapel Hill think that they think Jesus is God. And for them, they might say that Jesus was a human. They don't really think Jesus was a human. They think when Jesus was an infant, he could have spoken Swahili if he wanted to. I mean, because he's God, so God can do anything, right? But the traditional Christian doctrine of Christ is that he became a human, which means he limited. So he may well not have known he was God if he was God, if he's a human. So I'm not denying that Jesus is God. And so my personal beliefs I'm trying not to let them enter into this. I'm interested in this lecture in the question, did Jesus call himself God? And so this will take the whole lecture, and I'll lecture till I finish, and then I will take questions. That's the other reason I like this kind of setting, is because there's no class bell to ring, and so you aren't going to start gathering your things and leaving. You're stuck for the duration here. So did Jesus call himself God? Here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to talk about Jesus in the fourth gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The fourth gospel is the Gospel of John. And in the Gospel of John, it is quite clear in the Gospel of John, Jesus thinks of himself as God. It's unambiguous, I think, that Jesus' divinity is clear in the Gospel of John, and Jesus declares himself to be divine in the Gospel of John. Now, the clearest evidence of this is one I'm not going to put up as one of my examples, but just so you understand the clearest evidence of this, that Jesus, it's actually in John chapter 15, verse 1. This is irrefutable, I think. It's where Jesus tells his disciples, I am divine, you are the branches. John 15:1. Quite clear, unambiguous. Jesus is divine. Apart from that passage, Jesus in the Gospel of John, Jesus says things that make it quite clear. In John, he portrays himself as God. Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Abraham lived 1,800 years before Jesus. Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And when he says, I am, he's claiming the name of God from the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 3, Moses asked God, what's your name? And God says, I am. That's God's name. Jesus claims, I am. His Jewish opponents know exactly what he's saying. They take up stones to stone him to death. 2 chapters later, Jesus says to his opponents, I and the Father are one. I and the Father are one. The stones come out again. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. These are exalted claims. He prays in chapter 17, Father, glorify me with the glory that I had in your presence before the world existed. He was with God before the world existed in glory. And finally, at the end of the gospel, doubting Thomas sees that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and he says, my Lord and my God. There is no doubt in the Gospel of John, both that Jesus is understood to be God and that he understands himself to be God. And so what's the problem? If you're asking, did Jesus think of himself as God, this is clear as day. He says he's God, right? Well, that's right. In the Gospel of John, he's portrayed as calling himself God. But I'm not asking whether he's portrayed as calling himself as God in the Gospel of John, which he is. I'm asking, did the man Jesus himself, the man who was walking around in Galilee, did he actually call himself God, or is John putting these words on his lips? Did the man actually call himself God, or are these words put on his lips? There is something very interesting to notice that many people have never noticed. We have 3 other Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These 3 Gospels were all written before the Gospel of John. They are based on written sources or oral sources that we can somewhat reconstruct. Scholars can reconstruct the sources on which the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are based. They're called synoptic Gospels because these 3 Gospels can be they tell so many of the same stories that you can put them in columns next to each other and you can read the same stories because they tell the same stories, so you can see them together. The word synoptic means to be seen together. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are synoptic Gospels. They tell many of the same stories, and they're based on written sources that you can somewhat reconstruct. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus does not call himself God. None of these sayings from the Gospel of John is in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or in any of their sources. And all of those written sources about Jesus' words were earlier than the Gospel of John. That's very odd. Think about it for a second. Suppose you were a gospel writer in the early church and you're writing an account of Jesus, and everybody knows that Jesus called himself God. Would you leave that out? Like, that part isn't important enough to mention? That he thought he was God? Jesus doesn't call himself God in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or their sources. How is that imaginable if, in fact, they knew that he called himself God? They just, neglected to bring that part up? That's why scholars wonder whether the Gospel of John is historically accurate or not. I'm not saying that, I'm not denying its theological usefulness or its religious value. I'm simply asking, is it historical? And I think the answer is no. I think the Gospel of John is having Jesus mouth the words that explain the understanding of Jesus that the author of John had. John has put words on his lips, I think. Well, so I want to try and show that in the rest of this lecture. I want to try and show why it appears that the historical Jesus probably did not call himself God. Again, apart from the question of whether he was God or not. So, problems with knowing what Jesus said. Problems with knowing what Jesus said. So scholars for 300 years have known that it is difficult to know what it is Jesus said. Megan told me earlier that you've had Marcus Borg here with you. I hope some of you heard Marcus Borg. Marcus was a member of a group called the Jesus Seminar. He probably talked about the Jesus Seminar here because it's hard to get him to talk about anything else sometimes. Marcus loved being part of the Jesus Seminar. And the Jesus Seminar was a group of scholars that got together and decided on what parts of the gospel were historically reliable and which were not. They published an edition of the New Testament Gospels. In fact, they called it the Five Gospels because there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and another gospel called the Gospel of Thomas that didn't make it into the New Testament. And what they did is they published this and they color-coded the words of Jesus to show which words he probably said and which ones he probably did not say. So in the judgment of these scholars, the sayings that Jesus almost certainly said were in red. The ones that he said, kind of like what he said, are in pink. The ones, and then he probably didn't say those, are in gray. And the ones he absolutely didn't say were in black. To the shock of many people reading this book, only 18% of the sayings are in red or pink. 82% of the sayings of Jesus are in black or gray. So I wasn't on the Jesus Seminar. It's still going on, doing other things now, but I wasn't involved with them. I actually wasn't too surprised about the 18%. My problem was I thought they had the wrong 18%. but I thought the number was about right. But it's just a difference of opinion. Scholars have long known. Well, what's the problem? Why is it hard to know what Jesus actually said? You've got Gospels. So here's the reality. I have a book coming out on this next month. I've got a book coming out on March 1st that's dealing with just this problem, which is this. Jesus died around the year 30, say 29, say 33, sometime around the year 30, AD 30, or 30 CE, as we say in scholarship, 30 CE. The first gospel was Mark, written around the year 70. Last Gospel, John, written around 90 to 95. There's 40 to 60 years between Jesus' death and the first accounts of his life. That'd be like having the words of a preacher from 50 years ago show up for the first time this week. Not based on previous research, but based like the first time this week. The stories about what Jesus said were being circulated by word of mouth year after year, decade after decade, for 40 to 60 years before anybody wrote them down. So these were not written by people who were taking stenographic notes at the Sermon on the Mount. These are stories about what Jesus said by people writing decades later, which creates some kind of obvious problems in the Gospels. There are differences among our Gospels. I've pointed out one between John and the Synoptics about whether Jesus calls himself God or not. But there are lots of differences. Matthew doesn't tell the same story as Mark. John has a completely different story. They're all different from one another. And the problem is, a lot of the differences among the Gospels actually are discrepancies and contradictions. Now, I could be spending these 3 lectures talking about that, although you might find it a little old after a while, my students do, but I could show you that there are discrepancies and contradictions in the Bible, that this is common knowledge among critical scholars of the New Testament, whether they're believers or non-believers. It's just a reality. What you need to do, if you don't believe this, all you need to do is take a story in Matthew and read the same story in Mark or in Luke and compare them carefully with one another, word for word. Take the stories of Jesus' birth in Matthew and Luke. Compare them with one another and see if you can reconcile them. Take the stories of his resurrection in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and compare the stories. You'll find all sorts of differences in the resurrection narratives. The resurrection of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jesus is buried and somebody goes to the tomb. Who goes to the tomb? Women. How many women? Is it one woman? Depends which gospel you read. More than one? How many? Which ones? What are their names? Depends which gospel you read. What do they see there? Depends what gospel you read. Is the stone rolled away before they get there or after they get there? Depends which gospel you read. Are they told to go tell the disciples to go to Galilee to meet Jesus? Or are the disciples supposed to stay in Jerusalem to meet Jesus? Depends which gospel you read. Do they go to Galilee or do they stay in Jerusalem? Depends which gospel you read. Do the women tell anybody or not? Depends which gospel you read. They're up and down the line. You don't have to take a scholar's word for it. You can simply do it yourself. There are discrepancies and contradictions among the Gospels. The problem is if you've got 2 sources that are at odds with one another, they both can't be historically right. If you have 2 eyewitnesses to an event, for example, a car accident, and they contradict each other, one of them might be right, or they both might be wrong, but they both can't be right at the point of contradiction. Just how logic works. So that's a problem. Not only are there discrepancies and contradictions, there are theological perspectives that vary from one gospel to another. John is unambiguous that Jesus is a divine being. As we'll see in my next lecture, I'll talk about John's understanding of Jesus, which is quite a stunning understanding of who Jesus is. Other Gospels have other perspectives on who Jesus is. And they have different theological perspectives on lots of different things, as scholars have realized over the last couple hundred years. There are 2 implications of these various differences among the Gospels. One is literary. A literary implication is that if you've got different accounts that are different from each other, you should not read each account as if it's saying the same thing as the other. Every account is different, which means when you read Mark, you shouldn't assume that he means the same thing that John means. If you read Matthew, you shouldn't assume he's saying the same thing that Luke's saying. These are different books. We tend to read them as if it's like one big book, but it's because when you buy them, they're between 2 hardcovers, and it seems like one book. It's not one book. These are 4 books by 4 different authors. I would not like it at all if you read one of my books and a book by Jerry Falwell and assumed we were saying the same thing, because we're 2 different authors. Matthew and Luke were 2 different authors. And so literarily, if you read one, you ought to let him have his say and let him say what he wants to say and not assume he's saying what someone else is saying. That's the literary implication. But of greater interest for us in these lectures is the historical implication, which is that if these accounts are at odds with each other, then we have to engage in a historical reconstruction of what Jesus really said and did, because we can't simply list his sayings in the Gospels and say, these are the things he said. Because the gospel writers are imposing their own views on Jesus' words, as did the storytellers before them, and the storytellers before them, and the storytellers before them. Whenever somebody would say, oh yeah, Jesus said this, they would shape what they had to say based on their understanding of things and how they wanted to portray Jesus' teachings. And that ended up changing the things he said. And so we have to know, what did he say? Well, historians have worked since the 1770s on this question. This has been around for a long time. A few years ago, you may have noticed that there was a book on the historical Jesus by Reza Aslan. Did you all see this book called Zealot? It was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And he has his view about what Jesus actually said and what Jesus actually did. It's a very well-written book. I mean, it's a problematic book from a scholarly point of view for all sorts of reasons, but it was a very interesting book, and it was well-written. He's a professor of creative writing. He's a creative writer. It was a creatively written book, but a very interesting book. A few months later, it was well surpassed by Bill O'Reilly's book on Jesus, Killing Jesus. Y'all know that book? Bill O'Reilly, the Fox News commentator. Bill O'Reilly's book, he's certainly not a Jesus scholar. Bill O'Reilly's book, Bill O'Reilly thinks that what Jesus was upset about in his own context was he was upset with the Roman domination of the Promised Land. He didn't like the idea that the Romans were dictating, were asserting their authority over the land of Israel, especially because they were forcing Israel to pay so much tribute. Jesus wanted smaller government and lower taxes. It's right there. It's what he thinks. That's what Jesus wanted. So everybody, Bill O'Reilly to Reza Aslan back over 300 years have realized that these are problems. So how do we know what Jesus really said and did? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about a historical method for how we go about doing this. I'm simply going to lay out for you a very common view among scholars about what scholars for over 100 years have said about who the historical Jesus was and what he said. This view I'm going to lay out was first popularized by none other than Albert Schweitzer. Now, when I say that to my students, their eyes glaze over because they've never heard of Albert Schweitzer. But Albert Schweitzer, you all know about him for having won the Nobel Peace Prize and for being a medical missionary in Africa. You probably know that before that he was famous. Before that, he was a concert organist in Europe. He was also a philosopher. He had a PhD in philosophy. His most famous book, though, was his book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. This was a book that he published in 1906 in German. Von Reimarus zu Vrede, it was called. From Reimarus to Vrede was the name of the book in German, but it's in English, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. This was a survey of what everybody had said about Jesus up to his own day, what every critical scholar had said about the historical Jesus up to Schweitzer's own day, in which he showed that what everybody else had said up to that time was wrong. And then he showed what he thought was right. This was arguably the most important book written on the New Testament in the 20th century. Schweitzer was amazing. So you might not know this about Schweitzer. Schweitzer wrote this book while he was in medical school, studying to be a physician. When he wrote that book, he was also writing his biography of Johann Sebastian Bach, which became a classic in that field. At the same time, he was writing his book on pipe organ construction in France and Germany, which became a classic in that field. He was doing all these three books at the same time while he was studying to be a physician. And he was lecturing in philosophy in Strasbourg, and on weekends he was taking the train to perform organ concerts in Paris. So when I think about a life like that, I think, I can't really be like that because he didn't have ESPN. It's like he didn't have the same things to distract him. There's just, no Super Bowl or anything that he had to worry about. So that's why he could get so much done. So Schweitzer was amazing, but his book on the historical Jesus was a phenomenal book, and it changed how scholars looked at Jesus, and nobody agrees with Schweitzer's specific details of his reconstruction anymore. But the basic idea that Jesus is best understood as an apocalyptic prophet continues to be held by the majority of critical scholars today. So let me explain what I mean. Jesus, the apocalypticist. The word apocalyptic is a modern word. It's not an ancient word. It comes from an ancient word, apocalypsis, an ancient Greek word. Apocalypsis means a revealing, an unveiling, a revelation. So apocalypse is the Greek word that the Latin word revelation would stand for. So in the New Testament, you have the book of Revelation, which, by the way, does not have an S on the end. It's not revelations, it's revelation. I tell my students that if anybody in my class says revelations, they will be cast into the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is a hobby horse. So the book of Revelation, or sometimes called the Apocalypse of John. Why is it called a revealing or an unveiling? Apocalypticists believed, Jewish apocalypticists believed, God had revealed to them the heavenly secrets that could make sense of earthly realities. To them had been revealed the heavenly secrets that could make sense of earthly realities. There were a lot of Jews in Jesus' day who were what I'm going to be calling apocalypticists. I'm going to explain exactly what they thought here in a second. But there were a lot of Jews who understood, who were apocalypticists in Jesus' day. He wasn't unusual. This is one of the hardest things it is for my students to get to understand, is that Jesus was not unusual in his day. The point of view he had, the basic religious point of view he had, was a view that was common in his time. Of course it was. He was talking a language that people understood. Well, they understood apocalyptic thinking. This is what apocalypticists thought. First, apocalypticists, Jewish apocalypticists, were dualists. Jewish apocalypticists believed that there were two fundamental components of reality. Now, there are many people who still think this, so I'm not saying this is like an old-fashioned view. It started with Jewish apocalypticism, though. Two fundamental components of reality. There are the forces of good and the forces of evil. Forces of good, the forces of evil, and they're in constant battle. God, of course, is over the side of the good. The devil is over the side of evil. It's in the period when apocalypticism started coming about 150 years before Jesus is when people started thinking this way. That's when people started talking about the devil. When you read the Old Testament, there is no devil. The Old Testament was by and large written before all this thought came into being. The devil, the personal enemy of God who's opposed to him and his people, came about in Jewish apocalyptic thinking. God has his angels, the devil has his demons. God has the power of life. The devil has the power of death. God has the power of righteousness. The devil has the power of sin. Sin and death in apocalyptic thinking are not simply human phenomena. Sin is, for a Jewish apocalypticist, sin is not simply something you do that's wrong. It's not like when you cheat on your taxes or when you are mean to somebody. It's not just an act of transgression against God. Sin for an apocalypticist is a cosmic power that's in the world that is trying to enslave you. There's a demonic force out there that is stronger than you that's trying to force you to do its will. That's why sometimes you think, I know the right thing to do and I just can't stop myself. Why can't I stop myself? I've never had that feeling myself, but I hear that some people have. And those who have are being influenced by the power of sin. So death isn't just what happens when you stop breathing or your brain stops working. Death is a power that's trying to enslave you. When it gets you, it annihilates you. It's a demonic force in the world. There are demons in the world and forces of evil, and there are forces of good. So this is a dualistic way of looking at things, and everything and everybody is on one side or the other. There's no neutral territory. And so you have to decide. And if you don't decide, you've decided. You have to side with God or the forces of evil. This dualism of good and evil works itself out in a historical scenario for apocalypticists. There's a historical dualism between this age that we live in now and the age that is coming. There's this age and the age to come. Two ages. This age is controlled by the forces of evil, as you can tell just by looking around. Hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, drought, flood, famine, epidemics, birth defects, wars. I mean, look around. This is a cesspool of misery. Why? Because the forces of evil are in control. But God is going to intervene and destroy the forces of evil and bring in a good kingdom in which there'll be no more pain, misery, or suffering. The kingdom of God is going to arrive in which God will rule and the devil will be taken out of power. And God will make right everything that's wrong. So there are two ages, this age we live in now and the coming age which will be good. Pessimism, second tenet. I've got 4 tenets here. Second is pessimism. Jewish apocalypticists were not optimistic about the possibilities of life in this world. You're not going to make things better. Look, you can't prevent the flooding. You've got no control over El Nino. You've got no control over famine. You've got no control over drought. You can't control it. These things are bigger than you. You have no control over the power of sin. You don't have any control over the power of death. It's going to get you. You have no power over these things, and you're not going to acquire power because these things are more powerful than you. This age is going to get worse and worse and worse until the end, when literally all hell breaks out. So don't think that you can make things better by putting more teachers in the classroom or more cops on the beat or by raising taxes or by cutting taxes or doing whatever your political agenda is. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but it's just going to get worse. So they were pessimists because the powers in control of this age are more powerful than us. But they believed in ultimate vindication. God is going to vindicate himself. God created this world, and he's going to redeem it. He's not going to let it go on forever. God will redeem this world by destroying the forces of evil at the end of this age. Different Jewish apocalypticists had different ways of understanding how that was going to happen, but many of them thought there's going to be some kind of cosmic battle at the end of this age, in which God sends some kind of savior from heaven, a great figure who will destroy the forces of evil to bring in God's kingdom. Sometimes this figure is called the Son of Man, a human-like angel being who comes from heaven to destroy the forces of evil. Sometimes they thought about a coming Messiah, who might be a heavenly figure, might be a human figure, a Messiah figure. I'll say more about Messiah later, who would destroy God's enemies and set up God's kingdom. But it's going to happen. And this vindication that's going to happen, when God delivers the people on his side and destroys those against him, when that happens, that will happen not only to people who happen to be alive at the time. The judgment is going to apply even to people who have already died. Jewish apocalypticists were the ones who started thinking that the dead will be raised. Throughout most of the Hebrew Bible, throughout the Old Testament, you don't have any idea of a resurrection. Most ancient Israelites thought either that when you die, whether you're good or bad, you go to Sheol, this kind of shadowy existence that everybody goes to when they die, or they thought that you cease to exist. This life is all you have. That's the end of the story. That's taught in the book of Job, for example, in the book of Ecclesiastes. There are Israelites who thought that. So the idea that there's going to be a resurrection is an apocalyptic thought. The idea is that God's vindication is going to apply not only to the living, but also to the dead. God is going to raise people from the dead to face judgment. Those who have sided with him and suffered as a result will be rewarded. Those who have sided with the forces of evil and prospered as a result are going to pay an eternal punishment. You yourself are going to be raised from the dead. Don't think that you can side with the powers in charge of this world and become rich and powerful and influential and then die and get away with it. You can't get away with it because God's going to raise you from the dead. You're going to face judgment, and there's not a sweet thing you can do to stop him. A future resurrection. So, this is when resurrection became a topic in Jewish thinking with the rise of Jewish apocalypticism. When's all this going to happen? I mean, look, things are pretty bad now. I mean, how much worse can they get? I mean, how many more famines can we have? How much more flooding? How much more drought? How many more epidemics? I mean, this is as bad as it can get, right? When is the end going to come? For Jewish apocalypticists, the end was imminent. It is right around the corner. How soon is it? Truly I tell you, some of you standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come in power. The words of Jesus, Mark chapter 9, verse 1. Or as he says in Mark chapter 13, truly I tell you, he's talking to his disciples, truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. Albert Schweitzer argued that Jesus was an apocalypticist. He thought the world was controlled by forces of evil, but that God was soon to intervene to destroy those forces of evil and bring in his good kingdom on earth. When Jesus talked about a kingdom of God, he wasn't talking about what happens to your soul when you die. It's not that you die and your soul goes to heaven. No. In Jesus' teaching, there's going to be a resurrection of the dead, and it's going to come very soon when God intervenes. So that was Schweitzer's view, and I'm not going to go into the details of specifically how Schweitzer worked it out through the Gospels, because today scholars don't agree with his specific outworking of this view, but I will say, give a kind of a common view among scholars who think that Jesus was an apocalypticist, among whom I number myself. What is this point of view on in the words of Jesus? What did the historical Jesus really teach? Now, I need to say that I pointed out that there are problems with the Gospels for knowing what Jesus really taught. So how do I know what Jesus said? Well, what scholars have to do is they have to look at the traditions of the Gospels very carefully and apply rigorous historical criteria to them. You're looking for something, it's kind of common sense, actually. So you've got all these Gospels, and these Gospels are all based on earlier sources. And so what you want to do is you want to see, are there sayings of Jesus that are kind of similar to each other that are found in sources that didn't depend on each other, that are independent of each other? It's like, if you're trying to get an eyewitness to a crime, if you got a bunch of eyewitnesses that didn't collaborate with each other, that all say the same thing, well, that's good. So you look for lots of sayings that are kind of in scattered independent sources. And you look for sayings of Jesus that do not coincide with the perspectives of the people relating the sayings. That sounds weird, but it's like this. Suppose you've got a trial and somebody's on trial for a crime, and his mother, who loves him deeply, is on the witness stand, and under cross-examination, she says things that are incriminating. You can trust that she's probably telling the truth at that point, because she wouldn't want to say those things, but she feels that she's got to. Well, those things you're pretty sure she's right about. See what I'm saying? So if you've got historical sources that say things that are contrary to their own interests, those things are probably authentic. So there are criteria like that historians use, and you go line by line, you go word by word through the Gospels, and this is what you end up with in 5 minutes or less. So Jesus, throughout the Gospels, preaches that there is a coming kingdom of God. This is a dominant theme throughout Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It can be summed up in the earliest recorded words of Jesus. The first thing Jesus is recorded as saying in Mark chapter 1, where Jesus comes out of the wilderness, and he says his first words, where he says, "The time has been fulfilled. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the good news." What does this mean? The time has been fulfilled. That's an apocalyptic image. This age we live in now has a certain amount of time allotted to it, and the time has been filled up. In other words, we're at the end now. The kingdom of God is almost here. It's at hand. Get ready for it. Repent and turn to God, believing that this good kingdom is about to arrive. Believe the good news. That is the essence of Jesus' teaching. It's the first recorded words, and I think it captures what his ultimate message was. How's the kingdom going to come? Jesus taught that there is going to be a cosmic judge of the earth that he called the Son of Man, who's going to come on the clouds of heaven to destroy the forces of evil and bring in God's kingdom. People who have accepted Jesus' teachings will be rewarded when the Son of Man arrives. Those who haven't will be judged. Jesus says at one place, whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of that one the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes on the clouds of heaven in the presence of the holy angels. Mark 8:38. I think this is something Jesus said. Jesus talks about the Son of Man a lot in the New Testament. This is a very complicated field, but I have to say this, that many of the sayings that Jesus says about the Son of Man, we're not sure he really said those things. A lot of times when Jesus talks about the Son of Man in the Gospels, it's clear he's talking about himself. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He's talking about himself. The Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and be rejected by the scribes and elders and be crucified and then raised from the dead. He's obviously talking about himself. The question with every saying of Jesus in the New Testament is not, is that in the New Testament something Jesus said? The question is, did Jesus really say it? My view is the view that the sayings where Jesus identified himself as the Son of Man cannot be trusted as necessarily going back to Jesus, but there are some sayings about Jesus where he differentiates himself from the Son of Man. Those sayings are the sayings in which the Son of Man is a cosmic judge coming on the clouds of heaven to judge the earth. Why do I think Jesus certainly said those sayings? Because Christians would not make up sayings about Jesus in which he differentiated himself from the Son of Man. Because Christians thought Jesus was the cosmic judge who was coming back on the clouds of heaven. After his death, that's what the Christians thought about him. So when he uses Son of Man sayings talking about himself, it's not clear those actually go back to him. But when he talks about Son of Man as someone else coming on the clouds of heaven, those are ones he probably said. See how that works? Isn't that confusing? It's way too late in the evening for this. Right. Okay. I can tell by the look in your eyes. Okay. I'm not going to say that one again. So, the Son of Man is a figure who's coming on the clouds of heaven to judge the earth for Jesus, to bring in God's kingdom. When the Son of Man comes, there'll be a judgment and a reversal of fortunes. He will judge those who are living and the dead. And those who have sided with God and suffered will be rewarded, and those who have prospered by siding with evil will be destroyed. The first shall be last, and the last first. This wasn't just a clever one-liner that Jesus came up with, so we'd have something to say in the grocery line when we're behind, the first will be last, last first. No, I mean, he really meant it. The people who prosper now are going to be taken out of power, and those who are outcast now are going to be elevated. You need to prepare for this because it's coming soon. You need to prepare. You need to turn to God. You're living too much for yourself. You're not caring for the needs of others. You're only interested in yourself, but you should be interested in God and in your neighbor. You should live a life of service to others in humility before God. You do that, and you'll be rewarded when the Son of Man comes. You keep focusing on yourself, and you're going to be wiped out with everyone else. You need to prepare because the end is coming soon. It is right around the corner. It's almost here. Repent and believe the good news because the kingdom of God is at hand. Some of you won't die before you see that it's come. That's the apocalyptic teaching of Jesus in a nutshell. And so, what implications does that teaching have for understanding how Jesus understood himself? Who was he in his own opinion? A couple things to say. First, I think it is quite clear that if nothing else, Jesus thought that he was a prophet. Prophets in the Bible are not crystal ball gazers that are predicting what's going to happen in 2,000 years. If you go to your local Christian bookstore, you would think that's what the Bible prophets are. You'll have shelf after shelf about predictions about what's going to happen in the 21st century. You know these books? Just go to a Christian bookstore and ask for the prophecy section. So, I mean, when I was in the 1970s, when I was at a fundamentalist Bible college, we thought that the end of the world was coming at the end of the 1980s, because there was a book called The Late Great Planet Earth that said so. I don't know if you've heard about the book, The Late Great Planet Earth. This was the best-selling book in English in the 1970s, outside of the Bible. The best-selling book in English of any kind, The Late Great Planet Earth, which showed on the basis of biblical prophecy that the end was coming sometime in the 1980s. So when I moved to Chapel Hill, I moved to Chapel Hill in 1988, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I moved from New Jersey. Nobody in New Jersey thought about things like this, but I realized when I moved to the South, people did think about things like this. So I got there in August of the 1980s, and there was a book that was in circulation, largely in the South, but in other parts. You might have heard of this too. This was a book that was called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. Now, the rapture is when Jesus comes back and takes his people out of the world, and then there's a tribulation here on earth that takes place, and they're suffering for 7 years before the end comes. So this author, who was a former NASA rocket engineer, so he was a smart guy, this guy who wrote this book argued there are 88 reasons for knowing the rapture was going to occur in 1988. There are really interesting reasons. Before I give you one of these reasons, there were 2 million copies of this book in circulation. 2 million copies in circulation. I had a student whose parents literally sold the farm because they were convinced it was going to happen. 88, really? Rapture? 80? Yeah, okay, let me give you one. So, Jesus, when he says this generation will not pass away, so in Matthew's version of this, what Matthew says is, the disciples say, when's the end going to come? Jesus says, learn a lesson from the fig tree. When the fig tree puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So too, I tell you, when these things happen, you know that the end is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. So the author of this book said, well, what does this mean, the fig tree putting forth its leaves, this generation? In the Bible, the fig tree often represents Israel. When the fig tree puts forth its leaves, it means at the end of winter, when the fig tree is dead, it comes back to life. When did Israel come back to life? 1948. It became a sovereign state again. This generation will not pass away before all these things take place. How long is a generation in the Bible? 40 years. 1948 plus 40, bingo. That was one reason. He had 87 others. He was sure that Jesus was coming back during the Jewish festival of Rosh Hashanah in September of 1988. Somebody pointed out to this fellow that, the Bible says that no one knows the day or the hour when the end will come. His reply was, well, that's right. I don't know the day or the hour. I just know the week. Okay, so, and so again. So, biblical prophets, in fact, are not predicting the future. That's why everybody who thinks that they are predicting the future and tells you what they mean by them get it wrong. Every one of those prophecy books is wrong. And if you don't believe me now, wait 10 years and read one of them. And you'll see how wrong they are. It happens every generation. Well, biblical prophets were people who told forth God's word, who understood that God had spoken to them and they were speaking to their situation. And Jesus understood himself to be delivering God's message, and in that sense, he was a prophet. Did Jesus understand that he was the Messiah? My students almost all think that the Jewish Messiah was supposed to be a god. He was supposed to be God on earth. That is not what any Jewish thinker thought about the Messiah. The Jewish Messiah was not a divine figure. The Jewish Messiah was a human figure. The word Messiah simply means anointed one. The anointed one was the one that God had chosen to mediate his will on earth. The king of Israel was called God's anointed one. Israel no longer had a king who was the anointed one. Israel hadn't had a king for 600 years. There were no kings in Israel since the year 586 BCE. Well, some Jews thought God was going to bring about a kingdom where there'd be a king, and the king would be a human. The king would be the anointed one, and that's what they called the Messiah. The Messiah was the future king of Israel. That's what the Messiah was for Jews. So, did Jesus think that he was the human Messiah? So I just told you the common understanding of the Messiah, Jesus' view of himself. My view is that Jesus thought he was the Messiah. But what did he mean by it? The Jewish expectation of the Messiah was that there'd be a future king who would rule the people of Israel. Did Jesus think that he would be the future king to rule the people of Israel? I think the answer is yes. Here's why. I'll give you the short version of it. There is one saying of Jesus. I mean, there are a bunch of sayings of Jesus in the Gospels I think he really said, but here's one of them. This is one of the sayings of Jesus that I think Jesus absolutely must have said. There's a saying in the Gospels where Jesus is talking to the 12 disciples, and he tells them that when the kingdom of God comes, you 12 will be seated on 12 thrones ruling the tribes of Israel. You will be rulers in the kingdom, the 12 of you. Okay, why do I think Jesus said that? The reason I'm sure that somebody didn't make that saying up after Jesus' death, the reason I'm sure that Jesus himself said it, is because Jesus says this to all 12 disciples, one of whom was Judas Iscariot. No later Christian would make up the idea that Judas Iscariot is going to be the ruler in the kingdom of God. A Christian wouldn't have made up that saying, which means that it must go back to Jesus. Jesus really said that to his disciples. Okay, what does that have to do with Jesus being the Messiah? If the 12 disciples are going to be rulers in the kingdom, who's going to rule them? Jesus is the one who called them. Jesus is their master now. Jesus is their Lord now. Who's going to be their master then? Jesus is going to be their master then. They're going to rule the 12 tribes, and he's going to be the ruler. Jesus is going to be the Messiah. I have one other reason for thinking this. Jesus was almost certainly executed for calling himself the King of the Jews. Jesus does not go around in his public ministry saying, I am the King of the Jews. He doesn't go around saying, I am the Messiah. But when he's put on trial before Pontius Pilate in the Gospels, what does Pilate ask him? He asks him, are you the King of the Jews? What would make him ask him that? Jesus isn't going around saying, I'm the King of the Jews. Why would he ask him that? And when Jesus is crucified, there's a placard over his head saying, this is the King of the Jews. Why would that be the charge? There's no doubt that was the charge. It's in all of the Gospels, in all of the sources of the Gospels. This is what Jesus was killed for calling himself the King of the Jews. Why would Pilate think that? I'll tell you why I think Pilate thought that. I think Jesus did not publicly go around telling people, oh yeah, I'm your future king. But he did tell the 12 disciples that you 12 will be rulers. He must have taught them about what's going to happen in the kingdom when he would be installed as king. What did Judas betray? I don't think Judas betrayed simply where Jesus could be found in private. I think Judas spilled the beans. Jesus had been teaching his disciples that he would be the ruler and they would rule under him. And Judas went to the authorities and told them. And that's why Pilate knew that Jesus was calling himself the King of the Jews. And when he accused Jesus of it at his trial, Jesus couldn't very well say no, because he thought he was the future king of the Jews. And so they killed him for it. It makes sense of everything. It makes sense of Jesus' teaching. It makes sense of Judas's betrayal. It makes sense of Jesus' execution. Jesus thought of himself as the Messiah. Did he think of himself as the crucified Messiah? I don't think so. I don't think Jesus was planning to die. I think Jesus expected that the Son of Man was going to arrive and he would be installed as king. Because of that belief, he ended up getting crucified. And the disciples afterward started developing the idea that the Messiah had to be crucified, that the Messiah had to suffer. And that was the beginning of Christianity. That's where I'm going to pick up next time. Thank you. Okay, sorry I went on a little bit long there, but I will atone for my sins tomorrow. For now, does anybody have any questions you want me to address? Yes?
Counterpoint to study of his kingdom, he said his kingdom wasn't on the earth. What about the Sermon on the Mount and all that kind of stuff?
That's not in the Sermon on the Mount. The question is, what about when Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this earth? As it turns out, that saying's only in the Gospel of John. It's not in the other Gospels. It's found in the scene where Jesus is on trial before Pilate in John chapter 18 and 19. And it's a very interesting scene. One reason it's interesting is because, it's interesting for understanding the Gospel of John, because in the Gospel of John, the latest of our Gospels, Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. Jesus' kingdom is the world above. He's the king from above. He comes from above. You have to be born again to be born from above so that you can see the kingdom of heaven. That's John's teaching, the Gospel of John. I don't think it's the teaching of the historical Jesus. And that saying in John that my kingdom is not of this world is interesting for another reason, for historical reasons, which is in the Gospel of John, unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' trial before Pilate is just with Pilate. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what happens is the Jewish leaders bring Jesus to Pilate, and Pilate asks Jesus a question, then he turns and starts talking to the Jewish leaders, then he starts talking to Jesus, and it kind of goes, the crowds are all there, everybody's there for this trial. In the Gospel of John, it's not that way. In the Gospel of John, we're told that the Jewish leaders bring Jesus to Pilate, but they refuse to go inside Pilate's praetorian, his palace, because they don't want to be defiled, because they want to eat the Passover meal that night. Excuse me. And so they send in Jesus by himself. And Pilate talks to Jesus, and then he needs to talk to the Jewish leaders, so he goes outside to talk to them. Then he needs to talk to Jesus some more, so he goes back in to talk to Jesus. He goes back and forth 6 times. So when he's talking to Jesus, there's no one else there in John, where Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. Which raises a huge problem for knowing if the only people there were Pilate and Jesus Jesus went off and got crucified, how does John know what Jesus said? There was nobody there. Unless Pilate was giving interviews later or something. I mean, it's like so. I don't think that's a historical. It's a historical. You're absolutely right. That if Jesus did say that would certainly change things. But I'm not sure that Jesus actually said it. Yeah. Yeah. So he's asking about the conversation he has with Peter that's first recorded in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8. Jesus is talking to the disciples, talks to all the disciples, and he says, who do people say that I am? And people say, well, some people think you're John the Baptist come back from the dead. And other people think you're Elijah the prophet come back. And some people think you're some other prophet. He says, okay, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah. And it's interesting how Jesus responds. Jesus responds by saying, don't tell anyone. Wow. Next thing he says, so this is in the Gospel of Mark. So realize, as a New Testament scholar, every time I'm telling one of these stories, I'm doing two things. I'm thinking, what is Mark trying to convey by this story? What's Mark's view when he's conveying this story? And the second thing I'm thinking is, what is historical in this story? Which are two separate questions. It's like my literary and historical thing. The literary question, what is Mark trying to convey? And the historical thing is this historically right or not? Did this happen this way? What happens next is really interesting. Jesus then starts saying that he has to go to Jerusalem to be rejected and crucified and raised from the dead. And Peter says, no, Lord, that can't happen to you. And Jesus replies by saying, get behind me, Satan. So what in the world? Peter seems, it's such an interesting account for all sorts of reasons. One reason it's interesting, if you know, Mark's gospel is a fantastic gospel. It's my favorite gospel. The first 8 chapters of Mark, it's quite clear that Mark understands Jesus to be the Messiah, the Son of God. He does all these miracles, and he heals people, and he raises people from the dead, and he walks on the water, and he casts out demons, and Mark tells you he's the Messiah, the Son of God. But you read through Mark and you ask, who knows that he's the Son of God, the Messiah? And the answer is, up until this point with Peter, nobody. So Jesus' townspeople from Nazareth think he's just a local carpenter. How did he get so towards him? Isn't he the son of the carpenter? Or isn't he the carpenter? And so they don't believe in him. Jesus' family thinks that he's crazy. They come and take him away from public view because they think he's gone out of his mind. Chapters 2 and 3. The Jewish leaders think that he's possessed by the devil. He has Beelzebub in him. That's how he casts out demons, by the prince of the demons. So the disciples don't know who he is. In chapter 6, Jesus says, don't you understand yet? Chapter 8, don't you yet understand? No, they don't understand. And you go through all this. The only people who understand who Jesus is in the first 8 chapters of Mark, the only people who understand, God knows who Jesus is, because at Jesus' baptism, God says to Jesus, you are my beloved son. All right, so God knows. You would expect God to know, but there he is. He knows. Jesus knows because God speaks to Jesus. You are my beloved son. So Jesus hears him. Jesus knows he's the beloved son. Okay, so God knows Jesus. The demons know. Jesus casts out demons, and the demons cry out, you're the Holy One of God. So they know. The only other people who know are Mark, who's writing these things, and you, who's reading them. Because nobody else knows. Now, I'm just talking about Mark's understanding. This is how Mark is portraying Jesus. And then you get to this confession scene, and Peter says, you're the Messiah, and you think, they got it. They understand now. And Jesus says, and I've got to go to Jerusalem to be crucified. Peter says, no way, Lord. And Jesus calls him Satan. So Peter's starting to get it, but he ain't there yet. Because for Mark, Jesus is the Messiah who has to suffer. Now, I'm not saying that's historical, because I don't think it's historical, but it's Mark's way of understanding it, that Jesus is the Messiah. And if you don't get it, then you don't understand Jesus, for Mark. In fact, if you don't get it, you're inspired by the devil. You're Satan. Wow. It's a great gospel. Great gospel. Yeah. Yes. Mark's entire gospel was a literary attempt to explain. Mark has a really difficult situation in front of him. Mark is the first gospel to be written. The author of Mark thinks that Jesus is the Messiah, and the author of Mark knows that Jesus got crucified. Those two things are contradictory in Jewish thinking. If you get crucified, by definition, you're not the Messiah. The Messiah is supposed to be the king. The Messiah is supposed to be the one who overthrows the enemy. The Messiah is the powerful one of God. Was Jesus the powerful one of a man who got crucified? He's been humiliated and tortured to death. That's God's chosen one? Are you kidding me? If that's how God shows love on somebody, what does he do to his enemies? Man got crucified. There's no Jew on earth who would think that a crucified man could be the Messiah. Mark had to explain how it is that Jesus could be the Messiah if he got crucified. And that's what the whole gospel ultimately is about. It's absolutely right. Yeah. Yes?
Was that typical of learning the oral tradition first and then eventually writing? Is that true for all those centuries? That's how...
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that she's asking, you know, the tensions, the discrepancies, contradictions of the Gospels, is that kind of typical for oral cultures and for the people at that time? And I'd say, yeah, that's fairly typical, fairly typical. You know, so I've just written this book that I was mentioning that's coming out in a month, where I deal with just this question. One of the reasons I wanted to write the book is because when I give talks like this, I almost always have somebody tell me that they've heard that in oral cultures, traditions are preserved fairly accurately. Because, you know, if you can't write them down, you kind of have to tell them the same way every time, because otherwise, you know, so oral cultures preserve things accurately. And that's what I used to think, because that's what I heard. That's what everybody says. I mean, especially New Testament scholars. New Testament scholars are, I guess they're like every other scholar. They repeat a lot of things that they heard, and if everybody repeats it, then it must be true. So I decided for this book to look into it, and it turns out there's a whole field of study of oral traditions done by cultural anthropologists, modern cultural anthropologists, who have gone into places where there are ongoing oral cultures that are surviving without writing. This kind of research started in the 1920s with two Harvard professors who went into Yugoslavia, where there were professionals who told long stories and long poems that are as long as like the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And these people could recite these things. And these guys wanted to know, how did they do that? And they tried to figure it out, but in the process, they recorded what they heard. And this started this procedure of cultural anthropologists going into places like Rwanda and the other places in Africa where there are oral cultures and recording traditions. And what they found time after time after time is that in oral cultures, there is not a concern to keep things the same the way we think of. So that, like, if you tell me these two stories are the same, you mean they don't contradict each other. You know, there might be like a different nuance or something, but they're not at odds with each other. These oral cultures, you'll have somebody tell a story or recite a poem, and the next week they'll recite the same poem and they'll say it was the same. And by recording it, the cultural anthropologists will show, in fact, this one was twice as long as that one, with all sorts of themes not in that one, and differences from that one. It's like, so this is just what happened. So the problem is, here's what happened. Here's what happened historically. People who developed writing realized that you can check sources. In an oral culture, you can't check a source. All you can do is hear it again. Then you got to remember how you heard it the first time, but you've got to remember it because there's nothing to check. In written cultures, they develop ways of checking, and so we developed the idea that things ought to be the same. There ought to be consistency. That's a concern in written cultures, but it's not a concern in oral cultures. So when the gospel stories, the stories about Jesus were being circulated by word of mouth, they simply didn't have this concern. That's why you have all these differences. So the problem isn't that they're unusual. The problem is that they're what you would expect in this kind of situation. The problem is modern readers of the Gospels expect them to be something that they're not. That's the problem. Yes?
A technical question. Years before Jesus, what are those literary sources that you're deriving this from?
Yeah. Where do we get ideas about Jewish apocalypticism? So when Albert Schweitzer wrote in his book in the early 1900s, he had a number of Jewish texts available to him. The first full-blown apocalyptic text is actually in the Hebrew Bible. It's the book of Daniel. Daniel is the first known apocalypse that we have. There are other apocalypses written later that are not in the Bible, but they're Jewish apocalypses. The book of 1st Enoch, the book of 4th Ezra, the book of 2nd Baruch. There are a whole bunch of these. What happened since Schweitzer's day is they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of Jewish writings that are invaluable for understanding Judaism from about 100 years before Jesus to 50, 70 years after Jesus. These books were written roughly the time of Jesus by Jews who were living roughly where Jesus lived. So Jesus is not in the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's not mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. None of the disciples is mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Christianity is not mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are not Christian books. These are Jewish books. But they're significant in part. They're significant for lots and lots of reasons. But one of the reasons they're significant is because they embrace a thoroughly apocalyptic view. Particularly the War Scroll, but not only the War Scroll. The Habakkuk commentary, I mean, it's scattered throughout. But particularly, the War Scroll is a very good example, kind of the most obvious example of it. So, yes?
I'm sorry, I ain't got it yet.
Okay.
Mark is my favorite gospel.
Yes.
But I always had the idea that, that bad guy who betrayed Jesus did so because Jesus wasn't becoming the Messiah. He wanted a more aggressive approach to taking over the kingdom. All right. And you say a prophet and a Messiah, you write that Jesus was this. Well, the prophets in Israel were always sort of correcting the messiahs or the kings of Israel.
Yeah.
So there you got him in a dual mode,
Yeah.
and I'm lost.
Okay. Well,
Help me out.
I hope you're doing better by the time of the final exam. I hope you're doing better by the time of the final exam. Okay, you raised two issues, so I'll deal with both of them. About Judas Iscariot, about why he betrayed Jesus. Mark doesn't say that it was because he was nervous because Jesus wasn't going fast enough. That is an explanation that some people have given. They try to understand why did Judas do it. In the Gospels, there are different reasons assigned for why Judas does it in the Gospels. In one Gospel, it's because he kept the money box and he pilfered from it and he wanted the 30 pieces of silver. That's one Gospel. Another Gospel says it's because he was that the devil went into him. The devil made him do it. Another Gospel says that it was because he was the devil. So the different Gospels have different explanations, but none of them have the explanations that some historians have thrown out. One explanation that historians have thrown out is what you're saying. Is it possible that Judas thought Jesus was the Messiah, he expected him to be the Messiah, and Jesus ended up not doing anything he thought the Messiah was supposed to do, and so he thought he'll force his hand? Like, if he turns him over, then he'll have to reveal himself, and people will come to his aid, and he'll set up his kingdom. So that's one explanation. But it's not an explanation found in any of the Gospels. Other people think the opposite. Other people think that Judas thought Jesus was the Messiah, and he wasn't trying to force his hand. He realized that Jesus wasn't going to do anything the Messiah was supposed to be, and out of disappointment, he turned him over because he's just angry at him. So that's another explanation. So we don't really know the answer to that one. Right. I forget what your second question was, though. It was about something else. Oh, yeah, prophet and Messiah. No, it's a great point. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the prophets are constantly critiquing the king. And so if the king is the anointed one, then isn't prophet opposed to the king? That's absolutely right throughout much of the Hebrew Bible. So what ends up happening is that messianic expectations develop over time. And so by the days of Jesus, there were different Jews who had different expectations of what the Messiah would be like. And they weren't just basing their expectations on what they read in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah or something. So there were some, what I outlined as the view of Jews that he was the future king, that was a dominant view among many Jews expecting a Messiah. Other Jews expected that he wouldn't be just a human king, he'd be like a cosmic judge of the earth. The Son of Man might be like a Messiah figure. Other Jews thought that the Messiah would be a great priest who would be empowered to interpret the law of God for his people. And there were people who thought the Messiah would be a prophet-like figure, in part depending on what's found in the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, God calls Moses a great prophet, and he tells Moses that somebody else will rise up after you who will be like you. And so there was some expectation that there was going to be a prophet like Moses. And so sometimes Jesus is portrayed like a Moses figure. This fellow mentioned the Sermon on the Mount. So in Matthew's gospel, so here's how Matthew's doing Jesus. In Matthew's gospel, you have the birth of a child, and a king is out to destroy it, but God miraculously saves the child. It sounds like Moses. Moses was born, the Pharaoh tried to kill all the children, and he got saved. And then what does Moses do? Moses, he grows up, he goes into Egypt. What does Jesus do as a boy? Only in Matthew, his father and his mother take him and they escape to Egypt to get away from the wrath of the king. Only in Matthew. He comes out of Egypt. What happens when Moses comes out of Egypt? He passes through the Red Sea. What does Jesus do? He gets baptized. Water goes through the water. What happens then? Moses wanders in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days. See, this is all Matthew. Matthew's trying to show Jesus is the new Moses. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai and gets the law. Jesus goes up on the mount and delivers the Sermon on the Mount, which he begins by quoting Moses. So Jesus is the new Moses. See, so this is Matthew's way of doing it, that you don't find it. Mark doesn't have this stuff. It's Matthew that's doing it this way. Yes?
Well, I just wanted to know, your opinion, Christianity has been a long time, and why nothing was done previously to the 20th century with regard to this kind of interpretation.
Yeah, why didn't we have an interpretation like this before the 20th century? The first time you had scholars doing this kind of work was at the end of the 18th century. The first to do something like this was a guy named Reimarus, German scholar in the 1770s. Reimarus's view of Jesus was remarkably like the view of Reza Aslan in the book Zealot. Now, if you read Zealot, it sounded like Reza Aslan was coming up with this very inventive new way of explaining who Jesus was. This new way of explaining who Jesus was a way of explaining who Jesus was that was over 300 years old. But Aslan didn't acknowledge that part. I assume he knew it. I mean, he's not a New Testament scholar.
But my question is why?
Yeah, I'm getting to that. Yes, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. Right. So starting in the 1770s, you started having scholars approach the Bible from this point of view. So why not earlier? Why not in the 13th century? And the reason is because of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a movement that swept through Western Europe in the 18th, 19th centuries, where people started understanding the world differently. It's kind of like saying, why weren't there quantum mechanics in the 13th century? Why weren't they building nuclear bombs in the 13th? It's because science was predicated on different grounds back then, and they didn't have the same ways of understanding the world then that they had now. The Enlightenment changed not only science and not only our abilities in technology, it also influenced the way we dealt with texts and the whole discipline of history. The writing of history didn't exist before the Enlightenment. And so you can't have a historical approach to the Gospels until you have a phenomenon of history. And so that's why. It's because the understanding of the world that we inherited through the Enlightenment, that all of us have, we are people of the Enlightenment. We believe in cause and effect. We believe in the theory of gravity. we have beliefs that people didn't have in the 13th century, and it's just because of the Enlightenment. Other questions? Yes. 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 Is there any evidence to indicate that Jews thought the Messiah was God? Very little, but some. So I'm going to mention this in my next lecture. In my next lecture, I'm going to get to the question: if Jesus didn't think of himself as God, why did Christians start thinking that he was God? I'm going to talk about analogies from the ancient world in which other peoples, non-Christians, thought of a human being who could be God. You find this in Greek and Roman mythology and in Greek and Roman religion, but I'm going to argue that you also find it in Judaism. Judaism, strangely enough, we don't expect this. I didn't expect it when I started doing my research, actually, on this book some years ago. I didn't expect this, but I found out that it's absolutely true. There were Jews who thought that human beings could be gods. And one of the persons who is called God in the Old Testament is the King of Israel. What? Yep. I mean, it's weird, and when you read it, your eyes gloss over it, but it's right there. Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. To the King of Israel. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. To my Lord. There are passages, I'll talk about some of them tomorrow, where the King of Israel, how could they think he was God? They knew he was a man. Yeah, but ancient people had different understandings. This is why I said at the beginning that if somebody says Jesus is God, it's not clear what they mean. There are lots of options. You could think that a king that you knew as a human was also, in a sense, a divine being. I'll try to argue that tomorrow. So to that extent, it's imaginable that somebody could think of the Messiah as a divine being. Nobody thought that he was like God, the creator of the universe. But, even in the Gospel of John, in the Gospel of John, when Jesus says, I and the Father are one, and the Jews take up stones to stone him to death, he says, why are you stoning me to death? Why do you want to stone me to death? They said, because you're a man and you're calling yourself God. And Jesus quotes the Bible. He says, haven't you read the scriptures where God says, you are gods? He's quoting the Bible, where the Bible talks about human beings as divine beings. Now, it doesn't mean that they're God Almighty, but they're divine beings. So in the ancient world, this is another part of my lecture tomorrow, which maybe I don't need to give now. In the ancient world, people understood that, one mighty God, but below that there are other divine beings. We might call them angels, for example, or archangels, or something else, but ancient people had no trouble calling those other beings divine beings or gods. And the Messiah could in theory be classified there. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Mark's gospel, Mark's purpose in writing this gospel was not to demonstrate that Jesus was God, was it?
No.
Jesus is the Son of God.
Yes, that's right. I don't think Mark is meant to show that Jesus is God in the same way that John does. I think the Gospel of Mark does understand that in some sense Jesus is God, but he doesn't mean it in the sense that John does, as I'll explain tomorrow. They mean different things by it. Okay, I'm not going to do it now. That really is my lecture tomorrow. But I think Mark does understand that Jesus is the Son of God. That's absolutely right. Because at the baptism, God says to Jesus, you are my Son, my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. He's the Son of God. But what does that mean for Mark? I think it does mean that Jesus is divine in some sense. But what makes him divine? And how is he divine? And how can he be? The lecture I'm going to give on Sunday is, if Jesus is God and God is God, don't you have two gods? And you throw the Spirit in, don't you have three gods? So you're a polytheist, right? No, I'm a monotheist. I believe in one God. Well, which one? Yeah, well, God and Jesus and the Spirit. Those three. That's the one. What? So that'll be a lecture on the birth of the Trinity, how the doctrine of the Trinity came about. Yes? Yeah, she's asking whether I study all these other sacred texts too, the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas and the various texts of Talmud, the various religious texts, and so the short answer is no, I don't. I'm an expert on the Bible and on early Christian texts for the first 300 years, and I'm not an expert in other religions. If I had 48 hours every day instead of 24, maybe I would do that. Yeah. Yes?
I wondered if you could comment on the language, for example, the Bible was written in Greek, and how, I learned that Greek has more plasticity than anything. It's not so concrete.
Yeah.
You were defining things earlier.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Bible at one time wasn't that concrete.
Yeah. She's asking about language, and if the New Testament's written in Greek, and Greek's a different language, and it has different nuances, and it might be more elastic, and you can express things differently in Greek than you can in English, what do you... And so to be a New Testament scholar, you have to learn Greek. I mean, that's just... And so when I read the New Testament, I read it in Greek, because it's the only way you can really get the nuances. And it ends up mattering for how you interpret things. And part of the complication when you're talking about the historical Jesus is that Jesus didn't speak Greek. Jesus spoke Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of Palestine. Now, I said the highly educated people spoke Greek, but Jesus wasn't highly educated. That seems weird, but he came from Nazareth. Nazareth was a one-horse town. They've excavated Nazareth. There was nothing there. It was a dismal life, and so there weren't schools of higher learning there. So Jesus was not highly educated. I'm not saying he wasn't smart or incredibly wise or incredibly insightful, witty, or any of that. I'm just saying he wasn't highly educated. Didn't go to school. He didn't know Greek. He spoke Aramaic. So the problem is when you open your English Bible and you read the Sermon on the Mount, you're reading the words of Jesus. Suppose Jesus said these words. Well, you're reading them in English, which is a translation of the Greek, but the Greek is a translation of the Aramaic. And so if you're really going to study this stuff, you've got to do it in Greek, and then if you're studying the words of Jesus, you have to put them back, you've got to retranslate them back into Aramaic and see what they meant in Aramaic. It's really tricky, but sometimes it pays off. I'll give you an example. There are some sayings of Jesus that make better sense in Aramaic than they make in Greek. Okay, I'll give you one example. So there's a saying in the Gospel of Mark that is a very puzzling saying that nobody realizes is puzzling until you point it out to them. This is the saying. It says, Jesus has done something on the Sabbath. He's healed a guy on the Sabbath, and his opponents are upset with him for working on the Sabbath. And Jesus is trying to explain to them that it's okay to heal on the Sabbath, contrary to their rules. And so Jesus says to them, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. It doesn't make any sense. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord for the Sabbath. So I tell my students that in the Bible, when they come across a therefore, they should always ask, what is that therefore there for? Why does the fact that Sabbath was made for humans and not the other way around make Jesus, the Son of Man, the Lord of the Sabbath? Doesn't make any sense. But, in other words, it's a non sequitur. But If you put it back into Aramaic, it makes sense, because in Aramaic, the word man and the word son of man is the same word. Baranash. That's the word, Baranash, son of man. So, or man. So what if Jesus said this in Aramaic, it would be this. Sabbath was made for Baranash, not Baranash for the Sabbath. Therefore, Baranash is the Lord of the Sabbath. See? Now it makes sense. Humans are lords of the Sabbath, not Sabbath lords of the humans. So it makes sense. But it only makes sense when you transfer it back into Aramaic. What happened is when this thing got circulated and somebody translated that saying into Greek, they translated the first two Baranashes as man and the third one as son of man, so they would say something about Jesus in particular, even though it made nonsense of the saying. See what I mean? Yeah, okay. So this is, scholars of the Bible, this is why they don't study the Bhagavad Gita. They got to be reading things in Greek and, doing that instead. So, yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes? Yeah.
And I do quite frequently refer to the five Gospels when I really feel like I need to know whether something actually goes back to Jesus or not.
You do, yeah.
And one of the things I'm very disappointed that the Matthew 25 section goes to sheep and all that.
Yeah.
That's in black.
Yeah, it's in black, yeah.
And I was gratified in one of your New Testament lectures.
Yeah.
You said you really thought that it really did go back to Jesus.
Yeah.
It made me feel a lot better.
Good, I'm glad it makes you feel good. So he's saying that in the five Gospels, the book that Jesus put out, you've got these sayings in pink and gray and black. And I didn't mention this before, but I'll say it now. The Jesus Seminar disagrees with the idea that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. So the apocalyptic sayings of Jesus are in black. So it's like so counter to what I think, and counter to actually to what most scholars that work on this stuff. But anyway, that's the truth. And including this fantastic saying in Matthew 25, the parable, I don't know if it's a parable or teaching about the sheep and the goats, that I think Jesus actually taught. So remember, this is how it goes. So Jesus says that when the Son of Man is seated on his throne, the nations will be gathered before him, and he'll divide them like a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. So the sheep are on one side, the goats are on the other. And Jesus says to the goats, go off to your eternal punishment. Because they say, well, why? Because I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was naked, you didn't clothe me. I was in prison and you didn't visit me. And he goes on, you didn't do any of these things for me. And they said, Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or naked or in prison? We didn't see you. And Jesus said, truly I tell you, inasmuch as you did not do this to the least of my brethren, you didn't do it to me. Off to punishment for you. They go off to the flames of hell. On the other side are the sheep. And Jesus says to them, come into the kingdom of my Father. Welcome, because I was hungry and you fed me, and I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison, you visited me. I said, Lord, we didn't ever see you. Jesus says, truly I tell you, inasmuch as you did it to the least of my brethren, you did it unto me. So they enter into the glory of their Father. And that's the story. I absolutely think Jesus said this. And the reason I think Jesus must have said it is this. I don't think it's something early Christians would have made up and put on Jesus' lips. Because how did early Christians think people were admitted into heaven? By believing in Jesus. You get to heaven by believing in Jesus. How do these people get into heaven? They not only didn't believe in Jesus, they'd never heard of Jesus. Who's going to make up a saying that you can get to heaven by being a good person? Well, I would make up that saying, but early Christians wouldn't make up that saying, which means Jesus really said it. So I think this was Jesus' teaching, that it's by how you live that the doctrine of Jesus' death and resurrection came later and became an absolutely fundamental doctrine of Christianity, continues to be a fundamental doctrine of Christianity, that it's the death and resurrection of Jesus that makes you right with God, but not in that parable. In that parable, it's living a life of service to others, which is, I think, what Jesus taught. Okay, you're all looking kind of tired. I think people are looking tired. You're looking tired. I'm feeling tired. We're tired. Okay, I think we'll stop. Thank you very much.